The moment I noticed the document was missing, a chill crept over me. A sensation as if the very air in Somershall Palace had thickened, trapping me in a labyrinth of fear and guilt. I stared at the empty spot where I'd left it on my desk, certain it had been there only minutes ago. But now, nothing remained but a faint indent in the stack of papers, mocking my memory. The document was no mere administrative formality. It was a keystone in the palace's architecture of secrets, a slip of paper powerful enough to shake the very foundation of the royal family if it reached the wrong hands. My heart pounded as I retraced my steps, desperately scanning my memory. Somershall's hallways stretched out before me, silent and dim. Shadows seemed to lengthen with each hesitant step, and I could almost feel the walls pressing in, as though the very structure disapproved of my discovery. Even the air felt stale, as if centuries of secrets lingered, waiting to suffocate any whisper of truth. The document, a confidential file marked with the Duke's seal, contained a revelation capable of changing the line of succession. The implications swirled in my mind as I grappled with what I'd glimpsed in its contents just before it vanished. I wanted to believe it had been misplaced or mistakenly swept away by a staff member's eager hands. But deep down, I knew better. The palace, despite its splendor, had long felt like a living, breathing entity, one that held secrets far darker than even its oldest corridors. I froze as a faint sound echoed from somewhere in the corridor behind me. Was it merely the creak of old floorboards, or was someone watching me? The faint shuffling of steps came and went, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Every instinct urged me to be discreet, but my desperation for answers grew with each passing second. I had to find that document, if not for myself, then for the dynasty I'd pledged to serve. In my role as assistant secretary, I'd come to see Somershall differently than most. To the public, it was a place of regal elegance, a symbol of tradition and authority. But to those who worked within its walls, it was a prison of whispers, shadows, and secrets buried beneath layers of protocol and decorum. Only a select few had access to the palace's inner workings, and even fewer understood the complex web of allegiances that kept it intact. I was one of the trusted, or so I'd thought until now. My position granted me proximity to some of the most confidential matters of the realm. I'd seen files on international affairs, confidential treaties, and sensitive personal documents meant only for the Duke's eyes. But this document, this was something else entirely. Its contents gnawed at me like a parasite, burrowing deeper with every passing moment. If the truth within those pages were to become public, it would do more than upset a few members of the royal household. It would unravel the dynasty, stripping it of the legitimacy that held it in place for generations. For as long as I could remember, my loyalty had been unwavering. My father had first instilled in me a reverence for our leaders, telling me, "Arthur, loyalty is not just a duty, it's a legacy." I had taken those words to heart, dedicating myself to the very institution my family had respected and served. And yet, here I was, on the verge of a choice that could destroy that legacy. My breath quickened as the enormity of the situation settled upon me. I had two options: retrieve the document quietly, restore it to its rightful place, and pretend as though none of this had ever happened, or expose the truth and face the consequences that would inevitably follow. I closed my eyes, replaying the day's events in my mind, hoping to recall any detail that could hint at where the document might have gone. Perhaps I'd left it in the records room, where I'd stopped briefly to review old files. Or maybe it had slipped out somewhere in the hallway as I moved from one chamber to the next. I retraced my steps slowly, each footfall echoing ominously in the silence. Somershall was quiet at this hour, as most of the staff had retired for the evening. Only the faint glow of lamps lit my path, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and morph with each step. The portraits of past rulers lined the walls, their faces shrouded in darkness, eyes seeming to watch me as I passed. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the palace itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my move. My thoughts returned to the document and the single line that had caught my eye before I'd been forced to put it down. In the event of dispute, A succession of... The rest was a blur, obscured by the rush of the day. But the implications were clear enough. There was more to the royal lineage than I'd been led to believe, a hidden truth that had been carefully guarded for centuries. If what I'd glimpsed was correct, the dynasty's foundation was built on a lie, a deception so grand it could shake the nation to its core. As I wandered through Somershall, a strange sense of foreboding settled over me. This wasn't the first time I'd felt the weight of history bearing down, whispering secrets that only the walls seemed to know. I remembered once, years ago, finding a journal in the archives that had belonged to a long-dead advisor. Its pages were filled with cryptic notes and warnings about the consequences of uncovering the truth. At the time, I dismissed it as the ramblings of a paranoid man, but now I wasn't so sure. I reached the entrance to the Duke's private study, hesitating as I considered the possibility that someone might have taken the document deliberately. If that were the case, then I was no longer merely searching for a lost file. I was uncovering a conspiracy, one that might stretch beyond anything I'd imagined. My heart pounded as I placed my hand on the door, feeling the weight of the decision before me. Did I dare continue down this path, knowing it could lead to ruin? Then, as if in answer to my silent question, the distant sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. I froze, listening as they grew closer, each step sending a jolt of fear through me. I had to make a choice, and quickly. There was no time to weigh the consequences, no room for hesitation. I could only act on instinct, trusting that whatever decision I made would lead me to the truth, no matter the cost. Taking a deep breath, I slipped away from the door and retreated into the shadows, my mind racing with possibilities. Somershall was a maze of secrets, each corridor hiding a piece of the past, each room filled with memories long forgotten. And somewhere within those walls, the document waited, a silent reminder of the price of loyalty and the dangers of uncovering the truth. As I made my way through the dim corridors of Somershall Palace, the shadows seemed to close in, twisting and curling around me, like whispers lost to the centuries. This was more than just a building. It was a vault of hidden histories, each stone in the walls brimming with secrets that even time itself hadn't dared to reveal. My steps were slow and careful, as though some deep part of me feared disturbing the silence, afraid of the ghosts that might answer if I tread too loudly. Somershall had been a constant in my life, as familiar as the air I breathed, and yet tonight it felt foreign, unwelcoming even. Growing up, my father would bring me here on rare occasions, proudly showing me the rooms and halls he'd come to know so well over the decades. He was a man of few words, his loyalty to the Duke unwavering and absolute. But every so often, he'd let slip a hint, a faint murmur of something concealed beneath the grandeur and protocol. "Arthur," he'd say in his low, steady voice, "the palace may be beautiful, but it's full of shadows." At the time, I'd thought he was simply warning me of the politics and intrigue that came with serving the crown. But now, as I wandered these darkened halls in search of a single missing document, I wondered if he'd meant something else entirely. His cryptic words haunted me, echoing through my mind as I retraced my steps, hoping to find any trace of the lost file. I paused outside the records room, the memory of my father's stories flickering in my mind like an old candle. He'd often recounted tales of old palace staff who had stumbled upon things they shouldn't have. A sealed letter here, an abandoned journal there, only to disappear from their posts shortly after. At the time, I dismissed these tales as nothing more than harmless gossip, the kind of stories staff members told to pass the long hours of silence and duty. But tonight, with the weight of that document pressing down on my shoulders, those tales felt like grim warnings. Pushing the heavy door open, I stepped into the records room, where rows of ancient ledgers and files lined the walls, their spines cracked and faded from years of neglect. The air was thick with dust and a peculiar dampness that seemed to cling to everything it touched. I felt a pang of nostalgia, remembering how my father had brought me here as a boy, letting me run my fingers over the old books, teaching me to appreciate the weight of history. "These records, Arthur," he'd said with reverence, "they hold stories that no one will ever know. Secrets that died with their keepers." I swallowed, the words settling in the pit of my stomach. At that age, I had been enchanted by the mystery of it all. by the idea that Somershall held a hidden world, layered beneath its polished floors and stately rooms. Now, I felt that same mystery twisting into something darker, something dangerous. The document was somewhere within this palace, and I knew instinctively that its absence wasn't a simple oversight. Someone wanted it hidden, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking straight into a trap, guided by the ghosts of long-dead conspiracies. Scanning the shelves, I began to pull down files and journals that I'd thought might hold clues, each one a fragment of a story I hadn't realized I'd been piecing together over the years. There were entries and notes that seemed innocuous on the surface, but as I read deeper, I started to see patterns, hints that hinted at a concealed history stretching back generations. A record of a royal marriage here, a birth certificate with strange annotations there. Names that appeared and disappeared with unnerving regularity, as though entire branches of the royal line had been pruned away, their roots severed from history. One document caught my eye, a faded ledger labeled simply, "Ancestral Records." It was dated nearly 200 years ago and was signed by an official whose name I recognized from one of my father's stories. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing pages filled with names, dates, and cryptic notes scribbled in the margins. At first glance, it looked like a typical family tree, but certain names were crossed out, replaced by others written in hasty, almost desperate scrawl. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I realized what I was looking at. These weren't just records, they were revisions, alterations to the royal lineage, made in secret and carefully hidden away. Names were added, erased, rewritten, as though the line of succession had been molded and shaped to fit a particular narrative. My mind raced with the implications. If the true line of succession had been altered, then who was really meant to inherit the throne? And what of the document I was missing? Did it contain the final damning proof of these alterations? I leaned back against the shelf, my mind reeling. This was no simple oversight. It was a cover-up that spanned generations, a tapestry of lies woven so tightly into the fabric of Somershall that I couldn't tell where the truth began or ended. My loyalty to the palace had always been unshakable, yet here I was, holding evidence of a deception so vast, it threatened to unravel everything I'd ever believed. I thought back to the senior officials I'd seen earlier that evening, their hurried steps and whispered conversations as they moved through the halls. Had they known? Were they part of this deception? Or were they as much in the dark as I had been? I felt a surge of anger and fear rise within me, followed by a deep, unsettling realization. The truth was buried within these walls, but to uncover it meant placing myself in grave danger. I closed the ledger, my hands trembling as I slid it back onto the shelf. In that moment, I understood why my father had been so cautious, why he'd chosen to remain silent despite the things he must have known. This was a secret too dangerous to share, a burden too heavy for one person to carry alone. But I was no longer a child, and this was no longer a story told in the safety of my father's study. This was real, and the consequences of my discovery were far too severe to ignore. The sound of footsteps echoed outside the door, startling me from my thoughts. I quickly blew out the candle and pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear. Two voices, low and urgent, filtered through the heavy wood. "The assistant. He's been asking questions," one voice said, thick with annoyance. "Keep him out of it," the other replied. "He's loyal, but loyalty only goes so far. We don't need him complicating things." My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the voices. They were senior officials, men I'd worked under for years, men who were as much a part of Somershall as the very stones beneath our feet. My stomach twisted as their footsteps receded, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. They knew. They knew about the document, about the altered line of succession, and they were determined to keep it hidden. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the rapid beat of my heart, and fought to steady my breathing. I was in far deeper than I'd realized, and there was no turning back now. I had to decide, keep searching for the document and risk exposing myself, or walk away and live with the knowledge that I was complicit in a lie. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and stepped out of the records room, the shadows of Somershall closing around me like a cloak. I would find the document, no matter the cost, and I would uncover the truth that had been hidden for centuries, even if it meant unraveling everything I'd ever believed in. My pulse quickened as I left the records room, clutching the few details I'd uncovered like forbidden knowledge. In the grand corridors of Somershall Palace, I felt both dwarfed and empowered by the weight of history pressing in on me. Every step felt charged, as though I were trespassing in my own place of work. My footsteps echoed as I made my way down the hall, careful to avoid the path of any staff still roaming at this hour. Tonight, I had no allies, no confidants, only shadows and whispers for company. The palace at night was a different creature altogether. During the day, it bustled with activity, officials moving with purpose, their voices mingling in a constant hum. But now, a thick silence hung over everything, magnifying even the smallest creak of the floorboards, the slightest rustle of fabric. As I passed a window, the moonlight spilled through, casting an eerie glow across the floor, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air like tiny lost spirits. I had to be cautious. The conversation I'd overheard in the records room left me with an uneasy awareness that I was being watched, monitored by eyes unseen. I couldn't afford to be careless. My every movement felt scrutinized, as though the very walls of Somershall themselves were appraising my loyalty. The next day, I resumed my duties with a strained calm, performing my tasks as though nothing unusual had transpired. The facade of normalcy felt brittle, ready to crack at any moment. But beneath that outward calm, my mind was racing, trying to fit together the pieces I'd gathered. Who had erased those names from the record? What was the purpose of the revised lineage? And more pressingly, who had taken the document? These questions gnawed at me, eating away at my once unshakable faith in the palace and the royal family it protected. I'd almost convinced myself that I could return to the way things were, that I could forget the knowledge I'd stumbled upon when I crossed paths with Lord Edwin Loughton in one of the palace's lesser-used hallways. Lord Loughton was one of the Duke's closest advisors, a figure who wielded considerable influence within the palace, though he was seldom seen by the public. His presence was formidable. He carried himself with a quiet intensity that could unsettle even the most confident of individuals. "Arthur," he greeted, his gaze sharper than usual as it settled on me. "A word, if you please." The formality of his tone put me on edge. Lord Loughton rarely spoke to staff unless it was a matter of great importance. My mouth went dry as I nodded, following him into a private office just off the main corridor. The room was sparsely decorated, with dark wood paneling and an antique globe that seemed as old as the palace itself. Lord Loughton closed the door behind us, and an uneasy silence settled between us. He regarded me for a moment, as if weighing my worth, before finally speaking. "Arthur, I've heard some concerning rumors regarding certain inquiries you've been making about the Duke's affairs, if I'm not mistaken." My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "My lord, I assure you, any inquiries I made were purely out of diligence to my duties." "Diligence," he repeated, his tone flat, unreadable. "An admirable quality indeed. But you must understand, Arthur, that certain matters within Somershall are delicate, sensitive, if you will." He paused, his gaze penetrating. "The kind of sensitivity that requires absolute discretion from all who serve here." A bead of sweat trickled down my back as I realized what he was insinuating. He knew. Somehow he was aware of the document's significance, or at the very least my knowledge of it. The air grew thick, and I felt as though the walls were closing in around me, forcing the breath from my lungs. "My lord," I replied, choosing my words carefully, "I am devoted to my role here. I would never betray the Duke's trust." Lord Loughton's expression softened just a fraction, but his eyes remained cold. "I would hope so, Arthur. Loyalty is a rare quality in these times. But remember, curiosity, however innocent it may seem, can be a dangerous thing. A very dangerous thing indeed." He turned and opened a drawer from his desk, retrieving a thin, leather-bound journal. Without a word, he extended it toward me, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Perhaps this will provide the clarity you need." I took the journal with trembling hands, feeling its weight as though it were a stone pressing into my palm. As I opened it, I caught sight of handwritten entries. The ink faded but legible. The entries appeared to be written by a royal advisor from over a century ago, detailing the secret lineage revisions, the adjustments made to the line of succession, and the motives behind them. Every line seemed to confirm what I'd suspected. A secondary branch of the royal family had been kept hidden, maintained in secrecy as a safeguard. The further I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a record. It was a blueprint for ensuring that the current dynasty retained power, even if a legitimate heir was ever in question. Entire families had been moved, titles revoked, identities erased, all to preserve a specific line of succession, one meticulously shaped and pruned for decades. My stomach churned as the implications struck me. This was no accident or fluke. It was a carefully orchestrated plan that stretched back generations. And the document I'd misplaced, no, the document that had been taken, contained details that could disrupt this web of lies, unraveling the royal family's claim to legitimacy and plunging Somershall into chaos. Lord Loughton observed me closely as I absorbed the contents. His expression held no sympathy, only a calculating detachment. "You understand now, I trust, the gravity of the situation?" I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes, my lord." "Good. Then let us make one thing clear," he continued, his tone shifting to one of barely veiled menace. "This information does not leave this room. You are a loyal servant, Arthur, and I have no reason to doubt your dedication. But know that others would not look kindly upon such indiscretions." I swallowed, the taste of fear sour in my mouth. "Of course, my lord." Lord Loughton leaned back, seemingly satisfied, though a flicker of doubt passed across his face as he studied me. "See that it stays that way, Arthur. Some secrets are best left buried." With that, he dismissed me, leaving me to exit the room with the journal still clutched in my hands. As I closed the door behind me, I felt as though a noose had tightened around my neck. Lord Loughton's words echoed in my mind, a thinly veiled warning that my curiosity could be my undoing. But something within me resisted his threat. Yes, I was loyal, but the foundations of my loyalty had been shaken. I was no longer certain of the integrity of those I served. And though fear clawed at my insides, something else stirred within me. An anger, a sense of betrayal that I could not ignore. Returning to my quarters, I sat with the journal, rereading each line, memorizing each hidden truth. My hands shook as I realized the full scope of what I held. I was caught between my loyalty to the institution I'd been raised to respect and the growing belief that my duty lay not in preserving its lies, but in exposing its corruption. I knew then that there would be no peace until I uncovered the full extent of the deception. The document had vanished, but the truth was closer than ever. And no matter the cost, I would see it brought to light. I couldn't help but wonder, though, if Lord Loughton already suspected my intentions. His final words haunted me as I stared at the journal in my hands, a relic of lies and manipulation. Some secrets are best left buried, but I had no intention of letting this one die in the dark. As dawn broke over Somershall Palace, casting soft, filtered light through tall, arching windows, I awoke to a sense of grim determination. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind like a scene from an unsettling dream. Yet the journal rested on my bedside table, real and unyielding, its contents forever changing the way I viewed my duties. My choice was clear. Either continue my silent, passive service, or risk everything to pursue the truth. My father's voice echoed in my memory, reminding me of the importance of loyalty, the weight of serving a cause greater than oneself. But loyalty to what exactly? To a family that had deceived its people for centuries? To an institution built on the backs of hidden truths and silenced voices? A quiet anger simmered within me, a slow-burning resolve that urged me to keep going, to uncover the final pieces of this twisted puzzle. The palace seemed unusually quiet that morning, as if it too sensed the gravity of what was unfolding within its walls. I moved through the halls, a faint knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach with each step. It was a peculiar feeling, both a thrill and a terror, knowing that I walked alone in this pursuit. Somershall held countless secrets, but this one felt like the keystone to them all, a hidden linchpin that would unravel every carefully constructed lie. My first step was to examine the palace archives, hoping to find any records or accounts that could corroborate the journal's claims. The archives were a labyrinthine collection of ledgers, documents, and volumes dating back centuries, stored in a secluded chamber far from the daily hustle of palace life. It was a place of dust and dim lighting where forgotten stories lay dormant, waiting for someone to uncover them. As I descended the winding staircase into the archives, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight seemed to carry an air of suspicion, as though the palace itself disapproved of my mission. The chill of the underground room seeped into my bones as I began my search, poring over ledgers and sifting through documents that hinted at scandals, affairs, and political maneuvers, all hidden from the public eye. Hours passed, my eyes strained from the dim light and the relentless search. I found fragments, letters referencing the alternate lineage, documents signed by names I recognized from the journal, cryptic annotations that seemed to imply entire branches of the royal family were erased from the public record. But nothing provided the conclusive evidence I needed. Whoever had orchestrated this deception had done so meticulously, leaving only the faintest traces behind. Frustrated, I sat back, my mind swirling with unanswered questions. Had the line of succession truly been altered? And if so, who was the rightful heir? I sifted through the limited information I had gathered, piecing together a rough sketch of the secret lineage, a shadow family hidden in plain sight. This wasn't just an oversight or a misfiled document. It was a carefully executed manipulation that had preserved a specific line for generations. Just as I was about to close the last ledger in defeat, I noticed something strange in the corner of one of the pages. A single, faint symbol stamped in ink, almost invisible against the aging paper. It was the shape of a crown, crossed with an arrow, a mark I'd seen only once before, on the missing document. My pulse quickened. This wasn't an ordinary mark. It was a hidden seal, used only by those with access to the innermost workings of Somershall. My suspicion that the document's disappearance was no accident solidified in that moment. I knew I couldn't do this alone. If someone with authority had taken the document, my position as an assistant secretary wouldn't be enough to retrieve it. But I couldn't trust anyone within the palace either. For the first time, I realized the extent of my isolation, and the weight of that realization pressed down on me, suffocating in its severity. I was on my own, wading through a conspiracy that had taken root long before I was even born. As I emerged from the archives, the palace was beginning to stir with activity. Courtiers and staff moved through the corridors, oblivious to the secret war unfolding beneath their feet. I passed familiar faces, each one oblivious to the turmoil roiling within me. Was it possible that some of them were involved, or that they knew more than they let on? Paranoia began to creep in, clouding my thoughts as I studied the faces of my colleagues, looking for signs of deception. Then, just as I was leaving the archives wing, I spotted a figure at the end of the corridor. It was Lord Loughton, his gaze fixed on me with an expression of faint amusement. My heart skipped a beat, and I averted my eyes, hoping to avoid his notice. But he approached, his stride calm and unhurried, as though he knew exactly what I'd been doing. "Arthur," he said, his voice as smooth as silk. "I trust your morning has been productive?" I forced a smile, nodding politely. "Yes, my lord. Just reviewing some documents, as always." He arched an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving mine. "I do appreciate your dedication. Loyalty is, after all, the cornerstone of this palace." His words were a thinly veiled reminder, a subtle warning not to stray too far from my role. But the way he looked at me, the slight smirk, the knowing gleam in his eye, left no doubt in my mind that he was aware of my investigation. I felt a chill run down my spine as he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, leaving me alone with the weight of his unspoken threat. For the next few days, I forced myself to go about my duties as though nothing had changed. But every encounter with Lord Loughton, every sidelong glance from the senior officials, left me on edge, wondering if they knew the extent of my knowledge. I'd become a stranger in my own place of work, a spy in the very palace I'd once considered a sanctuary. I continued my investigation in secret, searching for more clues to the hidden lineage. My nights were spent poring over journals and letters, piecing together the fractured story of a shadow family. Yet for every answer I uncovered, 10 more questions seemed to arise. The deeper I dug, the more apparent it became that this deception reached farther than I'd initially imagined. It wasn't just about altering the line of succession. It was about controlling the narrative, ensuring that the chosen line remained in power no matter the cost. Then, one evening, as I studied a particularly old set of documents, I found an entry that sent a shock of recognition through me. It was a letter addressed to one Lord Harrington, a name that appeared frequently in the journal Lord Loughton had given me. The letter spoke of safeguarding the realm's legacy and preserving the line at all costs. But it was the final line that struck me with the force of a hammer. The crown is but a symbol. The true power lies in the hands of those who control the succession. I closed the document, my hands shaking as the full weight of my discovery settled over me. This conspiracy was more than just a hidden lineage. It was a shadow government, a group of powerful individuals who had been manipulating the monarchy from behind the scenes, ensuring that only their chosen line remained in control. The Duke and his family were nothing more than figureheads, pawns in a game played by forces hidden within the palace walls. I felt a surge of anger, a deep, seething rage that left me trembling. I had spent my life serving this institution, believing in its integrity, only to discover that it was a facade, a mask worn by those who sought power for their own gain. My loyalty had been misplaced, my faith shattered. Yet as I sat in the quiet of the archive, my anger gave way to a fierce determination. I could not allow this secret to remain buried, nor could I stand by as those in power continued their deception. If the truth had the potential to shake Somershall to its core, then so be it. I would see it brought to light, even if it meant risking everything. In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I was committed to this path, bound by the knowledge I carried and the truth I had uncovered. And as I rose from my seat, my resolve hardened, my purpose clear. The shadows of Somershall no longer frightened me. I would face them head-on, no matter the cost. The next morning, a heavy stillness hung in the air as I navigated Somershall's maze-like corridors, my mind still reeling from the night's discoveries. The knowledge I now possessed clung to me like a shadow, darkening everything around me. What I'd learned in the archives wasn't merely a footnote to history, but a revelation capable of dismantling the dynasty I had served for years. In the hushed corners of Somershall, the line between loyalty and betrayal had grown perilously thin, and I teetered on the edge, uncertain which side I would fall. I returned to my chambers and placed the journal and letters on my desk, regarding them as if they were artifacts from another world. In a way they were. They represented a history meticulously altered, manipulated, and hidden for centuries. And here I was, a mere assistant secretary, holding in my hands the evidence of an invisible empire that spanned generations. A pang of guilt shot through me as I thought of my father. He had dedicated his life to the service of Somershall, to a monarchy he believed in with unwavering faith. "Loyalty is our family's legacy, Arthur," he'd once told me, his voice filled with pride. "It's an honor to serve, to protect something bigger than ourselves." But his words rang hollow now, echoing in the empty chambers of my memory. Had he known? Had he glimpsed the darkness behind the crown, only to bury it beneath layers of loyalty? As the day wore on, I found myself retreating deeper into contemplation, wrestling with the weight of my decision. I thought back to my father's stories, the whispered secrets he'd shared, and wondered if he too had felt the same sense of betrayal that gnawed at me now. Perhaps that was why he'd kept those stories vague, never daring to delve into the full truth. Perhaps he had chosen silence, believing that some secrets were best left undisturbed. But I could not make the same choice. I could not ignore what I had uncovered, could not pretend that the truth didn't matter. If anything, the knowledge had given me a strange sense of purpose, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Somershall's walls, once a symbol of tradition and loyalty, now felt like a prison, and I was determined to break free. That evening, I returned to the archives one last time, driven by a single burning question. Who was the rightful heir? If the line of succession had been altered, then someone else, someone outside the palace's reach, was meant to rule. And if I could find that person, perhaps I could bring the truth to light, restore a semblance of justice to the institution that had deceived us all. As I combed through the archives, piecing together fragments of lineage and hints of hidden branches, I felt a creeping sense of dread. Every record I found, every alteration, every erased name pointed to a single truth. The dynasty I had served was built on the erasure of others. Entire families had been swept aside, their legacies erased, to ensure the preservation of a single, chosen line. And that line, carefully curated and maintained, was a lie. Hours passed, and my search yielded only more questions. I was close. So close I could almost feel the truth within reach. But the final piece eluded me. Frustrated, I leaned back, my thoughts spiraling in a haze of confusion and anger. The walls of Somershall felt oppressive, their secrets pressing down on me, suffocating any hope of clarity. As I sat there, lost in thought, I felt the weight of my decision settle upon me. To reveal the truth would mean dismantling an entire institution, a symbol revered by millions. It would mean tarnishing the legacy of a family that had shaped the nation's identity for centuries. And yet, to remain silent felt like a betrayal of my own values, a cowardly refusal to confront the darkness lurking behind the throne. In that moment, a memory surfaced, one I hadn't thought of in years. It was my first day at Somershall, years ago, when I was still a young man, eager and idealistic. My father had taken me aside, his hand resting on my shoulder as he looked me in the eye. "Remember, Arthur," he'd said, his voice steady, "the palace isn't just walls and stone. It's the heart of our nation, the soul of our history. To serve it is an honor, but it's also a responsibility. One day, you may find yourself faced with a choice, and when that day comes, I hope you'll remember what matters most." I had nodded, barely understanding the weight of his words. But now, as I sat in the dim light of the archives, I understood. The choice he had spoken of was before me, a path divided between loyalty and truth. And for the first time, I saw the palace not as a beacon of tradition, but as a fortress guarding centuries of lies. The following day, I met with Lord Loughton in one of the palace's lesser-used sitting rooms. He had summoned me under the guise of discussing administrative matters, but we both knew the true purpose of the meeting. His gaze was cold and calculating as he motioned for me to sit, his demeanor as impenetrable as ever. "Arthur," he began, his tone laced with forced politeness, "I understand you've been rather inquisitive as of late." I felt a flicker of defiance rise within me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Only as part of my duties, my lord." He studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Your duties do not include questioning the legitimacy of the line of succession." The words hung heavy in the air, a barely veiled threat. My heart pounded as I met his gaze, feeling the weight of his authority pressing down on me. "With all due respect, my lord," I replied, my voice steady, "I believe it is my duty to serve the truth. And the truth, as I have come to understand it, is that Somershall has hidden something far greater than any of us realize." Lord Loughton's expression darkened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a steely resolve. "You tread on dangerous ground, Arthur," he said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "There are forces at play here that you cannot begin to comprehend. The monarchy is more than a family. It is an institution, a pillar of stability that must be preserved at all costs." "But at what cost?" I shot back, unable to contain my frustration. "At the cost of truth? At the cost of justice? How many lives have been erased to uphold this facade?" Lord Loughton's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze hardening. "You would do well to remember your place, Arthur. Somershall is built on loyalty, on sacrifice, and those who cannot abide by that are removed." The threat was clear, a chilling reminder of the fate that awaited those who strayed too close to the truth. But as I looked at him, I felt no fear, only a deep, unwavering determination. "My place, my lord," I replied, my voice steady, "is to ensure that the truth is not buried beneath centuries of lies." He rose from his seat, his eyes narrowing as he regarded me with a look of barely concealed contempt. "Then you have made your choice," he said, his tone cold and final, "and you will bear the consequences." As I left the room, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I had crossed a line, a point of no return. But I felt no regret, no hesitation. The path before me was fraught with danger, but I was prepared to face it. In the days that followed, I worked tirelessly to piece together the final elements of the hidden lineage, gathering every scrap of evidence I could find. The truth was within my grasp, and I knew that once it was exposed, Somershall would never be the same. The dynasty I had once revered would crumble, but in its place, perhaps something purer, truer, would rise. And as I prepared to unveil the truth, I felt a strange sense of liberation, a freedom that came not from loyalty, but from the courage to face the shadows. For too long, Somershall had hidden behind a veil of tradition and power. Now, at last, the truth would come to light. The night was thick with silence as I walked the length of Somershall's vast corridors for what I knew could be the last time. Each step felt laden with history, with the secrets I'd uncovered, and the weight of the truth I now carried. I had prepared my findings meticulously, gathering every record, journal, and letter that proved the lineage had been altered and that the royal family I'd served was built on a lie. Tonight, I would deliver my evidence to the one person who might listen, a high-ranking official outside the palace, far enough from Somershall's shadow to see reason. The enormity of what I was about to do weighed on me like a leaden cloak. To dismantle the legacy of Somershall was to betray not just the institution, but everyone who had ever believed in it, including my own family. I could still picture my father's face, his voice echoing in my mind, urging me to hold to my loyalty. But now, as I stood at the brink, I knew that loyalty without truth was an illusion, a gilded cage masquerading as duty. My heart hammered in my chest as I passed the door to Lord Loughton's study. I could feel his presence behind it, the quiet power he wielded like an invisible sword. He had warned me, made it clear that any deviation from loyalty would lead to severe consequences. But I had crossed that line. My decision was final, and I would face whatever came next, be it exile, disgrace, or something worse. As I moved down the corridor, a voice called out from the shadows, "Arthur." I turned, my breath catching as I saw Lord Loughton emerge from the darkness, his expression unreadable. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill through my spine. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his tone as smooth as silk yet laced with menace. I met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "My lord, there are things within these walls that the world deserves to know. Secrets that should never have been kept." He studied me for a long moment, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps resignation or a hint of fear. "You're a fool if you think the truth will set you free, Arthur. Somershall is bigger than you, bigger than any secret you might unveil. It will survive, as it always has, and you will be nothing more than a footnote, a cautionary tale for those who dare defy it." The words stung, but I held firm. "The truth may be buried, my lord, but it is never truly erased. I may be forgotten, but the truth will live on." With that, I turned and continued down the corridor, my footsteps echoing against the marble floors. I could feel his gaze on my back, a silent threat, a reminder that he could have me erased as easily as the names in the journal I'd uncovered. But I would not be deterred. Reaching the palace's side entrance, I slipped out into the cool night air, feeling a surge of relief and fear mix within me. This was the point of no return. Whatever happened from here, my life would be forever changed. As I made my way toward the city, the grandeur of Somershall receded behind me, leaving only the quiet streets and the sound of my own heartbeat. Over the next weeks, the revelations I brought forward sent ripples through the realm. Officials and advisors were called into question, and whispers of scandal grew louder with each passing day. Yet for all my efforts, the wheels of power continued to turn, and Somershall's influence remained, though its image was irrevocably tarnished. I was discredited, cast aside, my position erased as if I'd never served within those walls. But I had expected as much. I had chosen this path, knowing the sacrifices it would require. And though I was silenced, my words lingered, spreading among those willing to listen. The truth had slipped from the shadows of Somershall, seeping into the minds of those who dared to question, to wonder if their trust had been misplaced. I found solace in that thought, a quiet assurance that, though I had paid the price, others would carry forward the fight for transparency, for a kingdom free from deception. Now, as I look back, I realize that loyalty, true loyalty, is not blind. It is a commitment to integrity, to holding those in power accountable for their actions. My journey has shown me that sometimes, loyalty to the truth is the highest form of service. Somershall may endure, but it will never again hold the same sway over those who have seen the cracks beneath its polished surface. To those of you listening now, I ask, what would you do if faced with a choice between loyalty and truth? Would you protect a legacy built on lies, or risk everything to expose the reality hidden beneath? These are not questions to be taken lightly, for the answers define not just institutions, but the very essence of who we are. If you've been captivated by this story, I invite you to join me in uncovering more hidden truths, more mysteries concealed behind walls of power and privilege. Subscribe to the channel, and let's continue this journey together. Remember, some secrets may be buried, but they can never truly be erased. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us explore what lies behind the veil of tradition. Because in the end, the truth is a crown no power can take away.